Our lecture today is going to be about drawing. And the best thing to do at the beginning of a drawing lecture is to actually do some drawing. So we're going to be doing a short directional activity first. Grab a blank sheet of paper, put it in landscape orientation so that the paper is wider than it is tall. And I'm going to read off the directions. If you get behind in the directions, just pause the video and catch up to us. And don't think too much about the directions, just do them. So the first thing you want to do, starting at the bottom left side of the page, is to draw a horizontal line about 1 inch long. Next, draw a vertical line about 3 inches long. From that point, make a circle and bring another line straight down. From there, make a horizontal line about 2 inches, then make a line that goes straight up. From that point, make a diagonal line about 3 inches, and then another one the same length going in the opposite direction. Bring a straight line down to where you started. And finally, go to the corner, draw a medium-sized circle with 6 short lines emerging from it. All right, so let's see how we did. This was the image that I described to you. And in a classroom setting, I would have grouped everyone in pairs, given one person the image, and then the other person would have to describe to the other person how to create this drawing. There are also going to be some links in the description box of this video to some other videos of some directional drawing assignments. So take advantage of those. It's kind of fun to actually do some art, but I want to really impress upon you how important drawing is. Because when we look at this painting, and it's kind of weird to show you a painting in a drawing lecture, but you have to know that this painting originally was a drawing. That's why we call drawing the foundation of art. It provides the basis for so many other artistic mediums. Think about architecture. You're not going to have a building that's built without the aid of a blueprint. And a blueprint is nothing more than a drawing. When we look at Edward Hopper's painting called Nighthawks, and it's a very famous painting, you'll see it in the Art Institute of Chicago, and even Starbucks takes this painting and transforms it into a Starbucks coffee shop, and they sell it on their mugs and such. But when we look at Edward Hopper's notebook, we can see that he did several sketches, what we would call preliminary drawings or preliminary studies, in the creation of this work. We see that no detail was left untouched, down to the salt and pepper shakers, and the way that in the image at the lower right, this lady's arm is positioned, whether she's holding the matchbook or not. And that is Edward Hopper's wife that he used as a model for that person. So preliminary drawings or preliminary studies, both are kind of synonymous terms, offers the artist a chance to experiment before putting something down in a much more permanent medium, such as paint. There's going to be 2 early forms of studies we're going to look at. And by early, I mean these are kind of like drawings from the Renaissance. And they're spolveros and cartoons. So a spolvero was first used around the year 1400. And we use it as a preliminary step in fresco painting. We haven't talked about fresco painting yet in this class. What's going to happen is in another couple of weeks, I'll post a video on painting, and you'll see how these were used to create a fresco image. I've also got in the description link below and on our titanium site a link to people actually using this process in a much more contemporary setting. So please make sure to watch that video as well. The videos do not play well on these screen recordings. So what a Spolvero is a full-scale drawing on paper of the object that we're going to want to transfer to a wall to then paint. And you don't really need to know the process of how the image is transferred, but I'm just going to walk you through it real quickly. You would have a stylus, which is kind of like, almost like a needle. And you would poke holes every so often around the outline of, in this case, the lower arm and hand. And this would be up against a wet plaster wall. And then you would tap charcoal dust on top of this paper. The charcoal dust would go through the holes and attach to the wet plaster. And so the Spolvero then was pulled down from the wall. It would have charcoal on one side, plaster on the other, and discarded. On the wall itself, you would have the remaining charcoal dust and a vague outline. So what happens is then the artist is going to go through and paint that. So it's a really cool image, and it's a really cool process. We'll talk more about it during the painting lecture. For cartoons, the image is slightly different in terms of transferring, but they're a little bit later. They're around the year 1500 is when these are used. But the idea is that these were discarded after their use. But when we get to this image at the left, the Madonna and Child with St. Anne and the infant St. John the Baptist, we have a work that's really considered quite beautiful. And it is by Leonardo da Vinci, and it was never used. We still have it originally intact, and very few Spolveros or cartoons have survived from the Renaissance. They were meant to be used. They were meant as a step to a greater artwork. So what happens with this here is that it got put on display, and people came from all around to see it. In fact, this image went on tour throughout Europe, and it's created around the year 1500. And that's when we start to see drawings start to be collected as artworks in and among themselves. An idea that drawing is no longer just a step to a larger project. It is, and it can be, a completed work of art. And that story is told in the Lives of the Artists, which is the very first book of art history. It's by Giorgio Vasari, and the chapters, it's actually a really great book. It's from the 1500s, around 1550 when it's first published. But if you ever get a chance to read that, definitely do. Each chapter is a different artist, and I'll tell you more about this book in our Renaissance lecture. So we're going to look at a variety of drawing materials today. We're going to look at metal point, sometimes called silver point. We're going to look at chalk and charcoal. We'll look at pencil or graphite, pastels, oil sticks, inks, washes, and we'll briefly talk about some innovative drawing materials. And we'll start off with metal point. Sometimes it's called silver point because silver is commonly used. This was a medium that was used frequently during the Italian Renaissance, but it kind of fell out of favor shortly thereafter. But you can still go to well-stocked art supply stores like the Art Warehouse down in Westminster, and they would have metal point kits that you could use. The stylus here holds a sliver of metal. Usually it's copper, sometimes silver, and during the Renaissance, if you were a very wealthy family, gold would work just as well. And so you see here St. Luke drawing the Virgin and Child using metal point. And I already told you about the different types of metal that would be used in the time period. But I need to also tell you that the paper that the metal is going to come into contact with has to be treated with a ground. Now, the ground would normally be consistent of powdered bone and gum water. I would never go into that much detail on an exam. I just want you to know the process of this. And so when you have the paper that's treated with the ground and the metal, whether it's gold, silver, or copper, comes into contact with that, a chemical reaction occurs and we get a very faint line. And so this is the type of image, and again, this is another work by Leonardo da Vinci. The image is very light. There's not a whole lot of different lines that we can create with metal point. It's mostly for contour lines. I'll show you a couple other images here. And again, they're great images, but there's just not a whole lot of versatility with this medium. And of course, using a precious or semi-precious metal, using a paper that had to be first treated with the ground, metal point quickly fell out of favor. But again, a few people still do it, but not many. Chalk is our next drawing material, and chalk comes in a variety of colors. It's not just white or black, but all the different colors. And it is composed of pigment that is held together by a binding agent, usually gum arabic, which is tree sap. And when we look at the different types of things we can do with chalk, it really is amazing. It creates a much different line than metal point. And so we can add like chiaroscuro to create three-dimensional images. Those hands at the top of the screen, that's by Diego Rivera. Down below is an image by Claude Lorraine. This image is just done with black and white chalk, but you can see a lot more versatile than metal point is. We're also going to talk about charcoal here, because charcoal and chalk can both be sharpened to a point for detail work, but also kind of like put on their sides for very broad gestural images as well. Now, charcoal comes in a variety of styles. It is created from burnt wood, and the density varies depending on which type of charcoal you buy. Toward the left there, those are more considered vine charcoal, which you would use for like an underdrawing on a painting. The images at the right, those are compressed charcoal, which is basically charcoal with a binding agent. It's much more like a pencil type of charcoal would be. And again, it can be sharpened to a point or it can be used on its side. Either way works fantastic. It's, illustrated here in Katie Colwitz's self-portrait. We've got a real fine detail in her hands and her face and very bold, jagged gestures that make up her arm to show that it might even be in motion. And charcoal is such a delicate medium. It's one of my favorites to use because you're always on that edge of, the work could very easily be destroyed if you're not careful. And so this is an extremely detailed work. But this image of, and I'm going to show you a series of 3 images of this tornado coming across the street. And this is much more of how charcoal truly is to work with. It's a very messy medium. We're going to move on to graphite or pencil. You see that we also have a variety of different types of leads to choose from. So when you look toward kind of the left-hand side of the box, it'll say 8B toward the bottom. that is almost pure graphite, and we have very little binding agent. Graphite is normally a very dark medium. It's very much like charcoal. It breaks very easily, and you have to be very careful because you can smudge. As we move to the far right, you'll see that we go all the way on the other side of the spectrum to the 8H, which is almost all binding agent and very little graphite. And the image you're going to make from that when you draw is very, very light. And so you have a huge range of different types of value that can create the image. It is, of course, the most common drawing medium we have. And my illustration in the book is by PRISCA Langlais, who was an artist at Cal State Fullerton. And in fact, some of her works are in their permanent collection. She would work from pure models. These images are life-size, and they are all done with pencil. The untitled image here, which we just call Ocean by VIJA CELMINS, is all done by pencil. You can see the range of values here, but I have another term I want you to associate with this, which is photorealism. And photorealism became popular in the 1970s, and what artists were doing then is that they were recreating photographs in other mediums, such as drawing and painting. So we're going to look at some drawing photorealism, and you can imagine, with all the detail that was in that ocean, how time-consuming it was for the artist to create it. So it probably took a period of 6 months to create something like that. And of course, if an artist is going to devote that much time to something, it's going to be expensive to purchase. So this again is a drawing. It's not a photograph, but it is based on a photograph. And usually, like photorealist painters and drawers, they'll work under like magnification, and they'll spend a long time on these drawings. Now, I'm also going to throw in my favorite artist to this lecture here. Laurie Lipton is currently still alive. She's originally from England, but now is in the United States. She is represented by Ace Galleries down in Los Angeles, and she's shown works in a lot of major shows. And I will link to her website as well in the description box. She does a lot of work with skeletons. She does a lot of work steampunk, and you should definitely check out her site as well. But this is all done in pencil. Some of the works have some charcoal added. These are fairly large works. Here she is being interviewed by Juxtaposed magazine, and this is her studio in Los Angeles. And you can see, like, especially with her being left-handed, that just indicates you're going to smudge when you draw. So there's that extra effort of keeping everything so pure and clean in these works. But again, I urge you to check out her website. And now we'll move on to pastels. Pastels are essentially chalk, but there's less binding agent present, so that they're a very fragile or delicate medium to work with. You also have to keep them away from bright light, and that includes flashes from cameras, because that will fade the pigment. There is special paper that you use to draw on for pastels, and there's also fixatives that you can spray on top of the completed drawing so that they don't smudge. Degas is one of the most famed artists who have ever worked in pastels, and many of the techniques that he created are still in use today. And of course, he's very much noted for his images of ballerinas. And we've talked about this image already in previous lectures, where you see her dress and her arms extend past the edges of the frame. bringing past and present together in this image. And also a very modernist point of view, looking down upon the ballerina instead of straight across. And these are a few other works of his using pastels. He unfortunately goes blind toward the end of his life, and he transfers these subject matters into sculpture. And if you're ever at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, these are on display there. They have the largest collection of Degas works on the West Coast. So if you like that artist, you definitely want to check out the Norton Simon Museum. And we also have Mary Cassatt. She learned from Edgar Degas, and she's one of the female impressionists. And she actually is American. She was born in Pennsylvania, went to the Pittsburgh School of Fine Arts, and then went off to Europe to join the Impressionists. Her images are usually of mother and child, and also siblings. And you can see here how the pastels really add to that, kind of spontaneity of the moment. They are a very sketch-like medium. And we're going to move on to oil sticks. Oil sticks are oil paint in a solid form. And we haven't talked about oil paints yet, so you don't know about their attributes, but you will in a couple of weeks. Oil paints are just kind of like a crayon. It's oil paint mixed with wax. And the great thing about them is that they're ready to use. There's no palettes, there's no solvents or brushes, palette knives to mix the paint together. There's no cleanup afterwards. So these are a very efficient drawing material, but they are very expensive. That is their biggest drawback. But there's also really no way of telling the difference between an oil painting and an oil stick drawing, since it's very much the same medium. We have liquid drawing material such as ink, and ink comes in a variety of colors. You can apply it with a brush or you can apply it with a stylus. And again, it's just it's just another tool to capture a very spontaneous moment. The image at the left here is by Rembrandt. And it's always amazing to me how, with just a few quick strokes of the brush, he can create an image. When we take ink and dilute it with water, we create a wash. And we can apply washes over drawings themselves to help add with that chiaroscuro effect, giving it some shadowing and some light exposure. During the 1700s, it was very popular, kind of like how when we talked about tenebrism, that was popular during the 1600s. Using washes on drawings was very popular during the 1700s. And this is my example of that. You can see just a normal pen and ink drawing. And then here we've got some stains on the paper that add some shadowing. We can see where the light source is, and it adds some three-dimensionality to these figures. And finally, I wanted to talk about innovative drawing materials. So here, I'm just going to talk about scissors, and I'm going to tell you about Matisse. Matisse is one of the most famous artists of the early 20th century. He was friends with Picasso. He worked in all different mediums. But what happened toward the end of his life, in around 1950, he developed arthritis so bad he could no longer hold a paintbrush or a pencil, but he could still manipulate scissors. And so his studio assistants would paint construction paper, different colors, and he would then go through and cut out these very organic forms. Some of them look like coral, some of them look like plant leaves. Either way, they would then be arranged on a larger medium. This is on tile, and this is from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And you can see how large these works are. They're absolutely gigantic. And Matisse does this for roughly the last 4 or 5 years of his life. In the same vein as Matisse, we have this artist here, Kara Walker, and she uses these cutout silhouettes for her work. And we're going to talk more about her and her style of art during the sculpture lecture, because this stops to become a single work of art and becomes what's going to be known as an installation. So I'm going to stop our lecture here. Don't forget to check the links down below in the description box, and I will see you at our next lecture.